Hello and welcome to Chess with Simon. I'm Simon. Today we're going to look at a really nice, sensible defense to the King's Gambit for black. So, as many will know, the King's Gambit starts with e4, e5, pawn to f4. In this line we're going to choose to accept the Gambit. We're going to assume that white plays knight f3 rather than bishop c4, which I actually like to play. d4, which is, I think, not great after queen h4 check. Knight c3, also not great after queen h4. I think, well, the engines prefer knight f3, don't they? And they think that white is only like 0.3, 0.4 worse. So why would anyone play this? Because it's beautiful, because it has a lot of tradition, because it's unique, because it's fun, all good reasons. So g5 is the most popular move. I mean, g5 is a very sensible move, like, you know, let's defend the pawn and let's get going on the king's side. Let's create a pawn which might even be able to displace the knight on f3, although that's all very complicated. But the move here, which is not the first, not the second, not the third, not the fourth, but the fifth move is bishop e7, which I've always enjoyed playing. I think Joe Gallagher wrote a book called Winning with the King's Indian, probably a long time ago, sort of pre-computer, like 20 years or something ago. And he said this was played by the well-schooled Soviet players, and I thought, well, that sounds like the kind of move for me. So developing a piece, we're sort of thinking about the check here. Now, I think what Joe Gallagher said is, if white plays bishop c4, as white should, then the check on h4 actually isn't great for black, because basically what happens is when the king moves, straight away, like knight f6 isn't a very good move because it drops the bishop. And actually, white's kind of okay here. I mean, white's not in such bad shape as white was after he or she first chose to play the King's Gambit. So, after bishop c4, we're not going to play the check. But just for the record, if white were to play knight c3, then the check does look really good. I mean, what happens after this? Let's have a quick look at the line. King e2. Often d5 is right. Yeah, d5. So we go d5. Knight takes, and then knight f6 and bishop g4. Okay, moves like bishop g4 makes sense. d3, knight f6. I mean, so white isn't losing, but the king looks a bit odd there. The king's bishop isn't very happy, so the king's rook isn't very happy, you know. It's sort of, I mean, okay, knight takes f4, knight c6. Put it this way, I'd prefer to have black in this position, but clearly there's a lot of interesting stuff to do. Bishop e3, and then what does Stockfish want? h5. Why h5? Don't know why h5. Defending the bishop. Knight d4 check, that's the kind of move I'd be looking at. Knight d4 check. Bishop takes, queen takes. I mean, it's kind of a natural thing to get the two bishops. G3. Okay, so the point is, after knight c3, one should play the check and then look for moves like d5, bishop g4, that kind of thing. After bishop c4, then it's quite interesting. The move is not bishop h4. Everyone plays knight f6. I used to have a Serbian coach called Velko, great guy, was a King's Gambit expert. And then when I showed this to him, he was like, well, d3. Then he was like, oh, d5. Is d5 the engine move? Well, the engine certainly quite like d5. d5, and then the point is, after takes, black just has a very healthy position. You know, I mean, sure, you can play, like here, bishop takes, queen takes, and I assume you can pick up on f4. But black's fine here. I mean, the engines say black's a little bit better. I wouldn't personally play g5 in this position. I think I would, I don't know. I mean, knight 6 looks nice. There's always some funny business around there being a sort of castles, and then the bishop takes and c7. Then you check here and win the bishop. I mean, in this particular position, that doesn't quite work. But there's lots of potential humour around that. I mean, if I was really in this position, well, the engines want g5, don't they? I suppose you can play knight a6 to defend the c7 pawn. Anyway, if they play d3, the answer is d5. But they don't usually play d3. They usually play e5. That's a much more common move. They can also play knight c3. After knight c3, do you you take? Yeah, right. You take here. That's the whole point, right? Well, that's a point. Takes, takes. Play the fork. Takes, takes. And then you kind of go, black is okay. d3. Bishop f5. Not a worry in the world. Pawn up. I mean, black's not winning, but well, black actually is close to winning, actually, as it happens. Black's a lot better there. So knight c3 is probably a no-no for that reason. So what they do is they play e5 most commonly. Indeed, that's what Stockfish does. And then the knight hops to... well, the knight always used to hop to g4. Look, if you look at the historic games, the knight was used to hop to g4. Now Stockfish wants to go to e4. Let's see. Well, let's look at the old line. The old line is g4. Then I think... Well, let's play it from the... play it from the engine. The engine says d4. Then I always used to play d5. Okay, actually now Stockfish... Well, Stockfish prefers d6, but they actually come out to the same line. d5, I'm going to play d5 because it's the same. Takes, queen takes, castles, knight c6. The engine wants, I don't think, but I mean basically what's happening is bishop e6. Yeah, that's nice, right? We assume that pawn d6 is not a terrible fork, and that's not a terrible fork because why? That is not a terrible fork because you play the queen check there. Okay, so this is the general idea. I would probably have castled a bit earlier, but the point is, the reason this is not a horror is because there's a check there and we win the bishop. Okay, and we don't want to play knight here. No, we don't, because then we just win in exchange and lose a piece. So instead we just pick off the bishop. So that pawn fork doesn't work, but maybe here instead of bishop e6 we would follow Houdini's advice anyway and just castle and not try to be clever risking that fork. So what have we just learned? What we've learned is that there's a nice main line. There's a nice main line that goes like this. e5, knight g4, d4, this. Takes, takes. But I think there's one other option, isn't there, for yeah. White can, instead of going d4, white can castle here. I'm not sure this is entirely different. Well, the engines want to go knight c6. Well, the engines want to castle. Let's do the engines. The engines want to castle. So castle, castle. What the guys often do in practice is they play h3. A lot of people play h3. Sort of the people I play anyway. And now, I always used to play knight h6 and look for these squares like f5 and even g3. But of course, the engine's got a crafty idea in mind. Let's just look. I mean, so a positional move is knight h6, which sort of makes sense to all of us, I think. Although we would note that now white is better. And we don't want that, do we? So, since we don't want white to be better, I think we have to play this engine innovation. d5. Okay, so you can't take the knight, because we'll take the bishop. But if they take en passant, oh, this is, you see it, right? They take en passant here. If they take the knight now, I assume the check here is what wins you the piece back. It must be. So they want to play knight a3, defending this loose piece, and then you get knight h6. So the main line, engine line, is, and no one's ever played this before, knight a3, and then knight h6, and then d4. But if you were to see this, which is not ridiculous, the point is this, and say you block it with d4, the point is this, and black's doing really well. So I think in summary what we're saying is I would suggest that after the king's knight's gambit, bishop e7 is solid and sensible. It has some clear ideas. It's not that common, and I've really enjoyed playing it over the years. Hope you're all well. See you soon.